Hello and welcome to the Voice of Todd. I'm Tom, and today we're going to talk about Wonder Woman 1984. I went to the cinema to see it last night. I love going to the cinema. It's a great experience. I think any film like this should be seen in the cinema. In fact, I would argue that most films need to be seen in the cinema. That's how they're made. That's how it should be. But let's get into Wonder Woman instead of me banging on about why cinemas are great. This film is directed by Patty Jenkins, it's written by Jeff Johns, who's done loads of DC stuff, and Dave Callaham, who did Doom, Godzilla 2014, and the upcoming Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings Marvel film. It stars Gal Gadot as Diana Prince, or Wonder Woman, Kristen Wiig as Barbara Minerva, or Cheetah, I think she's called, Pedro Pascal as Maxwell Lord, and Chris Pine as returning hero Steve Trevor, who was in the first Wonder Woman film. I'm not going to go into story spoilers. There will be some minor spoilers for some things, but I'm not going to go recap the story like I normally do with this stuff, because it's only just come out and I know a lot of countries won't be getting this in the cinemas, especially America. I do feel sorry for you guys. I'm going to read the synopsis that I pulled off from Google, and then I'm going to get into my thoughts on the film. So, decades after she defeated Ares amidst the First World War, Diana Prince strives to lead an everyday existence as the Cold War sets the United States on edge. Diana indulges in the modern amenities of the mid-1980s, yet continues to mourn her lost love, Steve Trevor. Yet, when two new enemies, media mogul Maxwell Lord and Diana's former friend, Barbara Minerva, threaten to upset the balance of the world, it's up to Diana to restore peace. That kind of sums up the story, to be fair. What I like. Gal Gadot, she's fantastic. She absolutely owns the part of Wonder Woman. She looks amazing in pretty much every scene. Obviously, she's going to. She looks amazing anyway. And she is an excellent Diana Prince. I didn't think her performance in this was as good as in the first Wonder Woman. That's probably because the first film had a much more of a buzz around it, and it was the first female-led superhero film, and there was a lot going on around that at the time. And I think it's because we've seen her a lot more than in the Zack Snyder stuff and Justice League for what that was, and she was in Batman vs Superman. So we have seen quite a bit of her in the role now, and it just didn't feel as fresh. But she is still an excellent Wonder Woman. Really enjoyed her in this. Kristen Wiig is also great. I enjoyed the geeky sort of klutz style that she has at the start. She's very lonely, kind of what you would expect a nerdy single woman in the 80s to be from the 80s films that I've seen. I enjoyed the transition into a much more powerful and confident woman in Act 2. There's definitely some Michelle Pfeiffer Catwoman vibes coming from her in this. Batman Returns, one of my favourite Batman films, and obviously there's a cat connection there, but it feels like she's channeling that, and that worked for me. There's also a tragic element to her, which I really bought into. I will touch on it here, although this is what I liked about the film. The CGI of her as a cat isn't as bad as Cats, but it's not great. We'll touch on CGI later, but that was a bit of a letdown. But in the first two acts, she's incredible. She's really good in this role. Pedro Pascal, I really like him. I've liked him since Game of Thrones when he was a Red Viper, which I thought he did an amazing job. Red Viper's my favourite character in Game of Thrones, and Pedro really brought him to life. He's been good in The Mandalorian for the most part. I actually really liked him in this. He's really gone all in with the whole 80s businessman vibe. He's totally stereotypical 80s dodgy dealer He totally owns it. There is more to the character than just that one dimension. I'm not gonna use the comparison because I don't think it's warranted here. His backstory is a problem for me. It does feel lazy. It doesn't take up much of the film, but it did feel lazy. For me, the standout in this film is Chris Pine. He stole the show. I like Chris Pine anyway. I did have reservations about him coming back and how they'd handle it, but the reasoning for him coming back does make sense. You really do feel it within the limits of the story. The plot around him is, I think, the strongest part of the film. His whole arc is a lot of fun. At the start, when he comes back, he has this childlike wonder of a man out of time with all the innovations of the 80s, which is really cool to see. His action stuff is great. He does have that vulnerability of being a human next to this goddess that really worked for me. The chemistry between him and Gal is it's insane. I'd love to see the two of them work together more, maybe on something that isn't superhero-y they can really get the teeth into. But I really bought them. I think they're an incredible duo, especially in this, and their scenes really do make the film for me. The opening scene, which I think has been either leaked or put out online, with young Diana in Themyscira taking part in the games, that worked for me, and there is a little tie-in to the story later on as well that sort of makes sense, and it looked great. The world itself, obviously we're in 1984 for the most part. You'd expect a lot of 80s nostalgia. Now, I was born in the 80s. I don't remember any of it. I was born later on. But this really feels like an 80s film. There's so much packed in there. The world is just pure 80s. The fashion, the music, the glitz, the lights, the new innovations, the technology, everything is just 80s. Really worked for me. This film, for better or worse, does feel like, at its heart, an 80s action film, which is both good and bad. Music is what you'd expect from the 80s. I like 80s music, so the soundtrack works for me. Hans Zimmer did a really good job with his own stuff as well. Obviously, Hans Zimmer's going to do a good job. There are a few elements in the film. First, I think the first two acts in this are excellent, and they have a huge amount of potential. The part that's set in Egypt, particularly the action sequence, I really got an Indiana Jones vibe, mainly because of Chris Pine. He would actually do a good job as an indie-like character. I've never really seen him that way. But it has this desert-y kind of indie feel. You'll maybe see where I'm coming from when you watch the film. And the final act, it really gave me Ghostbusters 2 vibes, with not just the visuals and how the world is, but it's like that kind of end of the world American city in the 80s that Ghostbusters 2 had. I love Ghostbusters 2, they're films I grew up on. So that was a nice little nostalgia hit. The final act itself we will talk about in a little bit more detail. Not in this part of the review though. The action sequence in Egypt was a big highlight for me. I think that's probably the best action sequence in the film. Really good, and you get to see a different dynamic of Wonder Woman as well, which is good. The best sequence for me, the one that really blew me away, was actually the 4th of July sequence. There is a minor spoiler here, so skip ahead 10 seconds if you don't want to know. But the Invisible Jet is part of this, and they are flying through the clouds and the fireworks going off. I think some of this was used in the trailer. Just that whole scene and how it's shot and the visuals are just amazing. One of the best scene. It's probably the best scene in the film. This is why you need to see films like this in the cinema. It's shots like that, just wonderful, really good. The things that I have issues with now, moving on swiftly. I think the story's kind of lazy. I don't think it's original, and it's quite thin for the length of the film. The film's 2.5 hours, and I didn't think it was engaging enough. By sort of the first 90 minutes, while I was enjoying it, and I do enjoy the film, I was checking my watch to see how long we had left, and I was surprised to find out that we weren't wrapping up when I thought it was starting to wrap up. There's another hour left. So the length and the quality of the story doesn't work for me. The CGI feels quite messy. Some of it looks absolutely amazing, like the scene with the fireworks. Just breathtaking. But that makes the stuff that doesn't look as good worse. I don't think the visuals are as clean as a lot of the other modern CGI heavy superhero films. It could be because they're trying to go for a little bit of 80s nostalgia to it, possibly. It does look, like I said, it looks very 80s, and one, that's a good thing because it's set in the 80s. But two, with the CGI, I don't think you can have an 80s film that looks and feels like the 80s and not have messy CGI. And I think that pulled me away. The scenes with the lasso really feel clunky. There's quite a few scenes as well of Diana up in the sky, either swinging with the lasso, swinging on the lightning you see in the trailer. There's a few other bits that I'm not going to touch on, but I'm guessing it's wire work. It didn't really look great for me. It just didn't work. And again, it's not enough to pull me out of the film, but I did make it's enough to make a mental note and think, oh, that's a bit ropey. As I mentioned, the action is very good. The camera's a little bit all over the place, especially in the final act where it's very CGI heavy, and I think this is all tying in with the last act. It's a mess. Because it's so CGI heavy in places, and with the action being quite fast and I'd say clunky, it really harms what is a weak act anyway. It's the weakest act of the film. There is a big hero moment, as you would expect, just after the White House section of the film. Probably half an hour, 40 minutes before the end, I think. But the last act is very paint by numbers. It doesn't really flow very well for me. It feels, for a film of this length, it feels rushed, which is weird. And I don't think it's rewarding. I find it very uninspired. They could have spent a bit more time explaining and building up to this, and it just feels like this happens now, this happens now, this happens now. And it's 2.5 hours, you've got so much time to play with. You didn't need to do it that way. The ending itself, again, I'm not going into spoilers here. The whole Maxwell Lord plot, in the last act, it's very clunky, and it didn't work for me. It's not a terrible ending, but I just think, again, it's lazy writing, and I think the film suffers from sequel syndrome, which I hope you know what I mean. It's not enough to ruin the film for me, and I did have a lot of fun with it, but I think the last act goes too far with what they were trying to do with the first two acts. It felt like a different film. Again, this is just my view. tell me I'm wrong in the comments. Please do. I'm doing this not to tell you what I think of the film necessarily, but to open a dialogue, and if you think differently, let me know. I'd love to talk about it, because I love talking about stuff like this, as you can tell. I do have a couple of nitpicks. Final scene of the film, after the resolution, it feels very forced and bolted on, and maybe an afterthought. It actually hurt the film for me. It does call back to, and it's quite a nice little nod to a moment earlier in the film you'll see when you see it. But it's set at Christmas, and it feels like, oh, we've moved the release date, we need to do something for Christmas because it's coming out in December. And it didn't work for me. Again, it's a nitpick, I'm being overly critical maybe, but that's just how I feel about that. It's a 2-minute sequence, but it just didn't fit following the last act. I also have, again, small nitpick, issues with makeup continuity, and I do get that Gal is one of the most beautiful women alive. You don't want to cover her face with bruises and things for a prolonged period, because she's the moneymaker in this film. But bruises don't heal in 10 minutes, and especially if you're a human like Steve Trevor. Both of them are magically bruise-free at a certain point after a big action sequence. And that, minor nitpick, I know, I'm just being fussy, but that pulled me out a little bit. Before I get into my final thoughts, is the film woke? I'm not going to do this with most film reviews. I don't really care as long as you're not destroying the film or the story or the characters with wokeness or forcing an agenda that doesn't fit. I'm usually forgiving. Do I think this film is woke? There's moments, for sure. I think every film for the last 10 years has woke moments. I think every TV series and reboots and reimaginings and whatever have woke moments for sure. It doesn't ruin it for me. I don't think they're pushing a real agenda as hard as maybe some other things have in the past. Again, it might just be that I'm choosing to not see it, and it might just be that my view of the world is totally different. I don't live in America, so that might be part of the reason. But I think they went a little too far with Maxwell Lord's character and his backstory. I think that's a real red flag for me. But I think the final act does a lot more damage to the film than any woke or agenda politics in here, which I think it's quite light, to be honest. I didn't notice anything that ruined any of the film for me. Couple of things before we do get into thoughts. Zack Snyder and Deborah Snyder both get a producing credit, which is nice to see. Obviously we're going into the Snyder Cut next. I think that's the next DC film or series. So that it's nice to see that they're still involved, and I suppose you have to give Zack Snyder credit for casting Wonder Woman. He sort of kicked all this off, and Gal's fantastic. And the mid-credit scene, even, I've written it wrong here, it's a nice nod to Linda Carter and her tenure as Wonder Woman. That's all I'll say. Do stick around for it, because it does work. Yeah, I had a lot of fun with this film. I think mainly it's due to Gal and Chris and their chemistry, but the whole core cast worked very well for me. It's a good superhero sequel. It's not Winter Soldier, which is, in my view, the best superhero film of all time, but it's nowhere near Batman Forever, which is probably the worst. It's a lot of fun. Part of the problem with this film, I think, is that it doesn't move Diana's character along very far. You start off in a place where she's obviously missing Steve. You kind of go full circle and you're back at the start of the film, without giving too much away. I thought that there would be more than that, but I think part of that problem is that this isn't part of an extended cinematic universe. The script is good. I didn't have any problems with the dialogue. There's nothing in there that felt out of place. It's like the world itself as well. It's good, but it doesn't feel original. I kind of think, again, that's sequel movie syndrome. I think it's a tough ask to follow a film like Wonder Woman, especially after how well that was received and being the first female superhero movie. There was a huge there was a lot of hype for it back in 2017. I think that DC do seem to want to have their characters stand on their own with their own films, whereas the Marvel view is to create this giant world that you need to see every entry. And I think that actually hurts DC, especially with films like this that are good, but they don't feel necessary. Marvel really captures the general public with this feeling that every film is going to push the wider story, regardless of who's on the front of the poster. DC don't have that with the collapse of the DCEU. If you love Wonder Woman, you're going to enjoy this film. Of course you are. If you like superhero films, there's fun to be had here, but it's not a must-see. I kind of feel, walking out the cinema, I feel like when I saw Aquaman. It's a fun romp. It's not really necessary. I am glad I got to see this in the cinema. Again, I've mentioned I love the cinema. I think that's the best way to see this film. I don't like having to wear a mask for 2.5 hours. Aside from the fact it messes with my beard, I don't find them comfortable. But to experience films like this, it is a small price to pay, in all honesty. I think my biggest gripe with this, outside of the final act being a mess, is that superhero films have gotten... We've had a lot of them. They're quite tired now. If they don't have a totally original world, or show me something I've never seen before, or do something in a different way that I wasn't expecting, I'm just gonna kind of enjoy it, and it's a popcorn flick. We've had so many superhero films over the last 10-11 years. I've seen probably all of them. I think this needed to do more to really be special. But again, it's, as I've mentioned before, it's sequel syndrome. It's not a bad film, it's just where do you go with a character when you've already seen quite a bit of them and they've already had such an impact. Final thought on Patty Jenkins and the Rogue Squadron announcement that's coming soon. 2023, I think. Do I think she will be a good fit for a Star Wars film? Off the back of this, Wonder Woman is something else. But taking them both into account off the back of this, yes, I think she'd do a good job. I would like to see Chris Pine in the lead, though. There's something about him working with Patty. I think she seems to get the best out of him. And the energy that he brings into the Steve Trevor role would be a great addition into, especially a film about ace pilots. You get that cockiness from him as Steve Trevor. I think with him, I'd be more interested, but yeah, I think off the back of this, she'd do a good job. I would recommend this film, but I don't think that it's a must-see. Have you seen this film yet? If you have, let me know what you thought. I'd be very interested to talk about it. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.